The fluorescent lights hummed in the concrete corridor of Folsom State Prison that October morning, casting harsh shadows across cell block C. A corrections officer stood outside cell 47, writing up yet another rule violation report. The inmate inside had arranged his bunk, storage, and personal space in a way that violated every standard placement protocol the California Department of Corrections had established over 40 years. Other officers called it stubborn defiance. The warden suggested mental instability, but the numbers told a different story. This inmate had survived 3 years without a single infirmary visit, without a single incident report, while inmates in regulation cells average 42 days before their first injury. The American prison system of the 1970s operated on principles established decades earlier, when the primary goal was containment rather than long-term survival. Folsom State Prison, opened in 1880 near Sacramento, housed 3,800 inmates in a facility designed for 2,200. Cell Block C, one of the older sections, contained 480 men in 240 cells. Each cell measured exactly 12 feet by 8 feet. 2 inmates per cell was standard, though overcrowding sometimes meant 3. The California Department of Corrections had established specific protocols for cell arrangement based on security, inspection efficiency, and uniformity. Every cell was supposed to look essentially identical. The standard configuration placed bunks against the back wall, parallel to each other, separated by approximately 3 feet. This left the front half of the cell open for the guard's sight lines during counts and searches. Personal storage went under the bunks or on small shelves mounted to the side walls. A stainless steel toilet and sink unit occupied one corner. The door, always steel with a small window, faced the open floor space. This arrangement had been refined through decades of corrections experience. It's what everyone did because it's what made sense from an institutional control perspective. But this conventional arrangement had problems that were injuring and killing inmates every year. And by the mid-1970s, those problems had become a crisis that prison administrators could no longer ignore. A bunk against the back wall created a massive blind spot. When an inmate lay on that bunk, he could not see the cell door without sitting up and turning completely around. The 3 feet between bunks meant cellmates blocked each other's sight lines constantly. An inmate working at the small desk area near the front of the cell had his back to his cellmate and to the door. The configuration created multiple positions where a man could be attacked from behind with no warning. In cell Block C alone, 63 stabbings occurred in 1975. 41 of those attacks came from behind, the victim never seeing the weapon until it entered his body. Underbunk storage was a theft magnet. Personal items stored in the dark space beneath a bunk were essentially invisible to the owner when he was anywhere else in the cell. Inmates reported an average of 2.3 theft incidents per year per cell. Commissary items, letters, photos, anything of value disappeared regularly. The constant losses created paranoia, mistrust between cellmates, and a need for retaliation that drove more violence. Men spent hours lying on their bunks specifically to guard their possessions, losing sleep and accumulating stress that manifested in other problems. Temperature control in these cells was brutal. Folsom's original ventilation system had been designed for far fewer inmates. Vents were placed high on the back wall, near the ceiling. With bunks against that same wall, the airflow hit the wall and rose immediately to the ceiling, where it circulated uselessly while the floor level remained stagnant. Summer temperatures in cell block C regularly exceeded 95 degrees. Winter temperatures, despite heating, often dropped to 50 degrees at floor level, while the ceiling area reached 70. The temperature gradient from floor to ceiling was typically 15 to 20 degrees. The health consequences were measurable. Medical records from Folsom between 1973 and 1976 documented 847 cases of heat-related illness during summer months. Respiratory infections spiked every winter, with an average of 42% of cell block C inmates visiting the infirmary for breathing problems, persistent coughs, or pneumonia between November and March. Inmates sleeping on lower bunks suffered worse than those on upper bunks due to the cold air pooling at floor level. Sleep deprivation was epidemic, with bunks against the back wall and the door in front, every footstep in the corridor, every guard making rounds, and every cell door opening anywhere in the block created noise that traveled directly through the door into the open front half of the cell. The steel and concrete construction amplified and carried every sound. Inmates reported averaging 4 to 5 hours of interrupted sleep per night. The chronic exhaustion contributed to shortened tempers, impaired judgment, and increased violence. The system's response to these problems was always the same: build more prisons, add more guards, implement more restrictions, but the fundamental cell configuration never changed because it served the institution's needs for control and efficiency. That the configuration was slowly destroying the men living in it was considered an acceptable cost of incarceration. By 1976, the situation had reached a crisis point. The California prison system was operating at 173% of capacity. Cell Block C saw an average of one violent incident requiring medical attention every 2.4 days. The average inmate in a standard cell configuration experienced his first injury, illness, or theft incident within 42 days of assignment. 3 years survival without any such incident was statistically almost impossible. Guards, medical staff, and some administrators knew the standard cell arrangement was contributing to the violence and illness, but institutional inertia and the massive cost of redesigning thousands of cells meant nothing changed. That was the situation facing the inmate who would make the discovery. His name appears in prison records only as Inmate 8, 4736, convicted of armed robbery in 1973, was sentenced to 8 years, assigned to cell 47 in Block C upon transfer from San Quentin in early 1976. His cellmate had been transferred to another facility 2 weeks before he arrived, leaving him alone in the 12 by 8 space. This was unusual. Single-cell assignments in overcrowded Folsom were rare, typically lasting only days before another inmate arrived. But administrative delays kept cell 47 single occupancy for 6 weeks, giving him time to observe, think, and experiment with something no one else had considered. He'd spent 3 years at San Quentin in standard cell configurations. He'd been robbed 4 times, stabbed once, superficially, in a dispute over a stolen radio, treated for pneumonia twice, averaged 4 hours of sleep per night. He'd watched cellmates cycle through the same pattern of theft, violence, illness, and exhaustion. He'd noticed that every problem traced back to the same source. The cell arrangement created blind spots, created vulnerability, created the conditions for everything that went wrong. The conventional wisdom in California corrections said, put the bunks against the back wall. He moved his bunk to the center of the cell. The conventional wisdom said store personal items under the bunk or on wall shelves where they were out of the way. He built a storage unit from commissary materials and placed it elevated and visible near the front corner. The conventional wisdom said keep the front half of the cell clear for inspections and guard sight lines. He arranged his small table, spare blankets, and books in specific positions that seemed to obstruct rather than open the space. The corrections officers noticed immediately. The first write-up came within 3 days. Inmate has rearranged cell in violation of housing protocol. Bunk must be returned to standard position against back wall. He ignored it. The second write-up threatened disciplinary action. The third threatened transfer to administrative segregation. Other inmates mocked the arrangement openly during yard time. One called it the stupidest setup he'd ever seen. Another suggested the isolation had affected his thinking. But Inmate 8, 4736, wasn't listening to the mockery. He was measuring results. From the center bunk position, he could see the entire cell with minimal head movement, the door, the vent, both corners, the elevated storage unit, every potential approach angle. The bunk placement put him approximately 6 feet from every wall, creating a reaction zone in all directions. If someone entered the cell, he had 1.8 seconds of warning before they could reach him, based on average walking speed. From a back wall bunk, that reaction time was 0.4 seconds for someone entering through the door. The elevated visible storage changed the theft equation entirely. Every item he owned was in plain view from the door, from the corridor, from any guard making rounds. Nothing was hidden. Nothing looked vulnerable. The psychology shifted from easy target to accounted inventory. In 6 weeks, 0 theft attempts. His previous cell at San Quentin had averaged one theft every 3 weeks. The strategic placement of his table and other items near the walls wasn't random obstruction. He'd noticed that the ventilation vent in cell 47 was positioned on the back wall, 2 feet below the ceiling, with his bunk in the center. The airflow from that vent traveled across the top of the bunk and circulated around it before hitting the front wall and dispersing downward. The air moved through the cell instead of rising immediately to the ceiling. The temperature difference between his bunk level and the floor was 6 to 7 degrees. In standard cells, that gradient was 15 to 20 degrees. He slept 6 to 7 hours per night. The center bunk position, farther from the door, reduced corridor noise by approximately 40% based on his subjective assessment. The air circulation kept temperatures more stable, eliminating the extreme cold at night that had plagued his San Quentin cell. He experienced no respiratory symptoms through the first 6 weeks, despite it being winter. By the time a new cellmate was assigned to cell 47 in late March, the evidence was becoming undeniable. Inmate 8, 4736, had maintained 0 incident reports for 6 weeks, 0 medical visits, 0 theft reports, 0 disciplinary actions beyond the initial housing protocol violations. The corrections officers stopped writing him up when they noticed he wasn't creating any actual problems despite the unconventional arrangement. The new cellmate initially resisted the setup, but agreed to try it for 2 weeks. He moved his bunk to a position parallel to the first, also in the center area. Both men could see the door and each other simultaneously. Both had clear sight lines to all corners. The visible storage system expanded to accommodate both sets of possessions. Within 3 weeks, the new cellmate reported it was the most secure he'd felt in 4 years of incarceration. The physics of why it worked became clear through systematic observation. The center placement created what spatial psychologists would later call a defensive radius. Human reaction time to visual stimulus averages 0.25 seconds. Add movement initiation time of 0.15 seconds. From a center position 6 feet from any wall, an average person needs 1.8 seconds to traverse that distance at walking speed. That meant 1.4 seconds of warning and response time. From a back wall, bunk with the door 3 feet away, response time dropped to 0.4 seconds. The difference between reacting and being overwhelmed. The elevated visible storage solved a fundamental problem of deterrence. Hidden items signal vulnerability. Thieves operate on opportunity assessment. A storage area under a bunk, in darkness, appears unmonitored. An elevated unit in direct sight line from the corridor appears accounted for at all times. Prison records from cell 47 showed 0 theft incidents over 3 years compared to the Block C average of 2.3 incidents per cell per year. The visibility itself was the security. The strategic furniture placement created circulation patterns that transformed the cell's thermal environment. Air entering from the back wall vent traveled across the center bunks and descended along the front wall, creating a convection loop. The constant movement prevented the temperature stratification that plagued standard cells. Temperature measurements taken in cell 47 in January 1977 showed a 6-degree difference between floor and ceiling. Standard cells in the same block measured 18 to 22 degrees difference. The improved circulation meant better air quality, fewer respiratory symptoms, more stable sleep temperatures. The unexpected benefits emerged over months. Other inmates noticed that cell 47's occupants seemed different, calmer, more alert. They walked with better posture, maintained eye contact, engaged in conversation with less aggression. The medical explanation was straightforward. 6 to 7 hours of quality sleep versus 4 to 5 hours of interrupted sleep changed everything. Cognitive function, emotional regulation, physical health, all improved with proper rest. the center bunk arrangement by reducing corridor noise and improving temperature stability, enabled actual restorative sleep. Guards noticed fewer complaints from cell 47. The occupants weren't constantly requesting cell moves, reporting thefts, filing grievances. The visible organization made inspections faster. Everything was immediately visible. Nothing hidden, no need to search under bunks or behind makeshift curtains. One corrections officer, more observant than dismissive, noted in a report that cell 47 required 60% less inspection time than standard cells. In July 1977, an inmate transferred from another block requested assignment to cell 47 specifically after hearing about the arrangement. He'd survived 8 months in a standard cell with 2 stabbings, 3 thefts, and chronic bronchitis. Within 6 weeks of adopting the center bunk configuration in his new assignment, his medical visits dropped to 0. He reported sleeping through the night for the first time in 2 years. The validation was becoming impossible to ignore. By 1978, the 5 other cells in Block C had adopted variations of the center placement system. Guards stopped writing violation reports when they realized these cells generated 70% fewer incident reports than standard configurations. The data was undeniable. Cells using center placement averaged 1 incident requiring medical attention every 437 days. Standard cells averaged 1 incident every 42 days. Word spread through the inmate transfer network. A prisoner from cell 47 transferred to Soledad in 1979 and implemented the system in his new cell. From there, it reached San Quentin, Corcoran, Pelican Bay. Each facility saw the same pattern: reduced violence, fewer medical calls, improved sleep, better mental health indicators. Some corrections administrators quietly began recommending the arrangement to vulnerable inmates, elderly prisoners, those with medical conditions. The technique encountered resistance from institutional bureaucracy. Housing regulations, written in the 1950s, specified bunk placement against walls. Changing those regulations required legislative action. Some wardens saw the non-uniform appearance as unacceptable, a loss of control through visual disorder, but the cost savings data was compelling. Each violent incident cost the state approximately $2,800 in medical care, investigation, and processing. Each respiratory illness averaged $340 in treatment. Cells using the modified arrangement saved an estimated $1,200 per year in incident-related costs. By the mid-1980s, several California facilities were incorporating defensive radius principles into new cell block designs, bunks placed farther from doors, storage units designed for visibility, ventilation systems positioned to create circulation rather than stratification. The Federal Bureau of Prisons reviewed the California data and began testing similar arrangements in 3 facilities in 1987. The innovation worked because it addressed the actual problem inmates faced rather than the abstract problem administrators imagined. Convention optimized for institutional control, uniformity, and efficient processing. But inmates weren't being processed. They were surviving years in confined spaces with constant threats. The center placement optimized for that specific reality: more warning time, better sleep, reduced vulnerability, lower stress. The improvement in those variables cascaded into everything else. Inmate 84736 was released in 1981 after serving his full sentence. His name appears nowhere in corrections literature about cell design innovations. He probably never knew that his arrangement, born from observation and experiment in cell 47, would influence housing protocols across multiple prison systems. He was solving an immediate survival problem with the space and understanding available to him. That's what real innovation looks like. Not following established protocols, but understanding the actual problem. Not doing what everyone says is correct, but observing how things actually work. Not accepting convention when convention is optimized for the wrong variables. Having the courage to arrange your cell wrong when wrong is exactly right for staying alive.